So I think
Hey
we'll watch
everyone.
this today.
I am in fact again playing my high-risk hardcore Iron Man, and there will be videos on the main channel very soon, but that's not why we are here today. About 2 months ago, I made a video on my main channel discussing how PvP has a serious problem. To quickly summarize that video, PvP basically does not really get that many updates anymore. There's no dev time for it really, and new content is not coming into the game. And along with that, fewer and fewer players actually find themselves engaging in PvP, and even if people want to engage in PvP, they have no idea where to start. So basically, I suggested that we need to tutorialize PvP and add in a bunch of different aspects to teach you how to not only tank, how to escape, how to properly fight back if you want to actually learn how to fight back, and just how to do basic different types of PKing. The goal of that video was truly to just get a discussion going on PvP and the wilderness as a whole. I wanted to make a video on this channel kind of discussing it in a much more casual setting, since there is more to talk about with the wilderness. The way that the wilderness works now is basically the way that it has worked forever. Put a piece of content in the wilderness that players want to interact with, say a wilderness boss, then PKers come along and try to PK those players, then other PKers try to come along and PK those PKers. This obviously does work to some extent. As a PKer myself, I mainly don't really care about going after other PVMers. Obviously, I've done it, but you want the bigger loots in the wilderness, and the players that are going to give you the bigger loots are the other PKers. I personally am not interested in PKing any sort of Iron Man in the wilderness, unless they have just a crazy amount of risk, but obviously, other people are interested in PKing those Iron Men.
Yeah,
maybe
those
because
jerks
they just aren't
that are
that
after
good at
me.
PKing the other PKers, so they want to go for the easy targets. Again, this system does somewhat work, but players at the
I mean, I'm not that easy of a target, right, guys? Okay, maybe I am.
bottom of this food chain that are just there to get the items are getting more and more annoyed with it. Nobody wants to interact with the wilderness if they don't have to. And again, you cannot blame them for not wanting to interact with the wilderness if they're basically just the loot pinata. Of course, the sentiment didn't always used to be like this, but as RuneScape as a whole has become safer and safer over the years and become way more for the casual players as well as the ironmen, way more players take issue with how the wilderness is designed. Dying in RuneScape in general used to be a lot more punishing than it has been for the past 10 or so years. If you used to die at some place like God Wars, you would basically only protect 3 or 4 items if you're using protect item, and everything else would be lost. The only place that this is still true is the wilderness, and it's obviously only if you get PK'd by another player. All in all, I would say that the general appetite for risk in a game has gone down, at least in a game like this, because again, it's a lot more casual than it used to be. The vast majority of players do not want to interact with the wilderness or do not want to interact with PvP in general, and honestly,
when you died in PVM, you used to lose everything on you except for a few pieces, and it would fall on the ground. Wait, why do I remember this? I swear, I have a memory in my head of when I was like 12, and I died on like my Dragon Slayer quest or something, and I was panicking trying to run back to pick up my items. And it was like super intense. That's how it used to be, right? All of your stuff would drop on the ground and then you had like a minute to get back or somebody else could pick it up. Holy crap, what a flashback.
that is completely fine, but there is still a subsection of players that do want to interact with PvP. Maybe they don't know how. That's why I think it would be cool to eventually add in the idea that I suggested in that video where you tutorialize PvP, maybe make a little quest on how to learn how to PvP. Even if people just want to do it for the quest points and then they never actually PK, that's fine. But the problem is, as of right now, players feel compelled to go into the wilderness so they can go and get items from the wilderness. I would say the best example of this is the Mage Arena 1 and Mage Arena 2 cape, since as of right now, the Mage Arena 2 cape is the best in slot cape. Now, eventually, I got to imagine that some sort of Inferno-like thing is going to come into the game and give you a new best in slot magic cape, so you don't even need to go into the wilderness and then you have the new best in slot thing. I think that's completely fine. I'm sure it's going to eventually happen, but there's other pieces of content too. I would say mainly like the Void Waker, but that's more so for Iron Men. Now, obviously, when someone chooses to play as an Iron Man, they are limiting themselves, and if they want to go and get an item, they have to go and interact with the content of where it's from. So if they want a Void Waker, they are willingly signing up to go into the wilderness, but that doesn't make it any less annoying, though, to get those items for that Iron Man. And the thing is, there are a lot more Iron Men these days than there are PKers. The opinion used to be that you willingly signed up for a restricted game mode, but that's no longer the majority opinion. Now the majority opinion is obviously siding with the Ironmen that it's annoying to be PK'd by players when you don't even risk anything. And again, that is the truth. It is annoying to be PK'd, especially when you don't have that much risk. Jagex saw this problem, and in an attempt to appease both crowds, they took one item that is very useful outside of the wilderness, the Dragon Pickaxe, and added it to the Calphite Queen drop table outside of the wilderness, so players would not need to interact with.
I think that this is cool. I think that maybe the items shouldn't exclusively drop from the wilderness, but if you have like the Dragon Pick, like there's obviously a much worse place to farm it. So I mean, Calphite Queen is arguably so bad that it's not even an option to farm a Dragon Pick. Like, in my personal opinion, it's such a bad boss to farm that I just would not even farm it for pick. But I think that that's an exception. Like, that's acceptable because if you want the better way of doing it, then you have to go to the wilderness, and that's the risk versus reward. That's a good risk versus reward, in my opinion. It's almost so painful to farm it that you just have to go to the wildy.
The wilderness to get this specific item if they did not want to. I wasn't really sure about this move when it happened a few years ago, but honestly, looking back, I do think it is a very smart move to do. I think that is a really good example of Jagex addressing a pain point of the wilderness. So players that never want to interact with the wilderness simply do not have to, at least for that item. Players that still want to get the item within the wilderness can still do that, and they can still make good GP in the process, but at that point, they are willingly signing up for the prey versus predator aspect of the wilderness. As it currently stands though, that is the only item that Jagex has given this treatment. That's what brings me to the main point of this discussion today. How do we make the wilderness better for everyone? There's a way to make the wilderness really good for players that want to interact with it and make it so players who don't want to interact with it basically never have to. And I think that is the middle ground that needs to be found in order for wilderness updates to actually pass. As it currently stands, there is content in the wilderness that is really not benefiting anybody, and it only kind of serves to annoy both parties, the PKers and the PVMers alike. I'm of course talking about clue scrolls, specifically the hard, elite, and master clue scroll steps that are all in the wilderness. I genuinely think there is next to no point in having any of these clue steps be in the wilderness anymore.
Okay, is he cooking with that? I say this
as someone who has probably PK'd like 500 plus clue scrollers, maybe 15 or 20 of them at most actually had any risk on them. The vast majority do not have risk because people know if I'm going into the wilderness to do this clue step, I need to bank my stuff. As the PK, I basically just waste my time killing the vast majority of them thinking that they could have something. And as the PVMer, it's just extremely annoying to have to de-gear from all of the gear you have on just to go into the wilderness and do one clue step just to then put back on your stuff. And that's without even being PK'd. Then on top of it, if you actually do get PK'd, at best, you don't get annoyed. You understand it's the wilderness, whatever. But at worst, it does annoy that person. I don't think that's a healthy interaction for either player in that circumstance, especially if the player that is going to do the clue, that's one of their first times in the wilderness. So you don't want that to be their first impression. You don't want that to be their general impression of the wilderness, that they're just gonna go there and die and not lose anything and just get ticked off. I personally see no point in having those clues be in the wilderness, and instead, if you still do want to have clues in the wilderness, you can make wilderness specific clues with a wilderness loot specific drop table. A good example of some of the rare items that can be in this are the Dagonhai pieces that you would already get from the wilderness. You can of course have different rune items too. You can put things like ether in there. You can put resources for PKing in there. There are plenty of items that already exist that would be the perfect fit as rewards for these clues. An update like this I feel works perfectly because players who do not want to interact with the wilderness no longer need to for one less thing, clue scrolls, and players that do want to interact with the wilderness now have their own clues that they can do all within the wilderness. I think wilderness updates,
but it's still counter to his first point, which is people don't risk anything in the wilderness. So if they're just doing wilderness clues, they still wouldn't be risking anything in the wildy. So how do you solve people going to the wilderness when they're not risking anything? Do you guys think war mode would work for the wilderness? where you have a higher chance of drop. Like it's a flag system where you can flag up or unflag. And then if you're flagged up, like you meaning you can be attacked, then you have a higher chance to get drops. But if you're unflagged, you have a lower chance for drops, but you just can't be attacked. That's kind of like Scald, but you just flag up with less gear. You just flag up and not risk anything. Yeah, I guess it wouldn't work. I mean, I don't know. I was just kind of thinking out loud, like a war mode for retail WoW, where you get 10% less experience if you're not flagged up, but then nobody can gank you in the real world, which I prefer that. Like I just don't ever want to die, so I'll just take the 10% less experience. I don't know if a system like that would work for RuneScape, but they have that in retail WoW. You definitely don't lose anything on death in WoW. It's just an annoying time thing. So it's way worse in RuneScape when you die.
Do deserve to come into the game overall, and the wilderness does deserve to be expanded upon. But the thing is, there has to be some sort of compromise moving forward. With the benefit of hindsight, I think that a really good philosophy for how to get items into the wilderness is to also give them an alternative to get outside of the wilderness. Something like the Voidwaker, personally, I think that it's really cool that it is a wilderness-only item, but the thing is, a lot of people do not like that. I genuinely do believe that if you were to try and pull the Voidwaker to come into the game only from the wilderness in today's day and age, it would absolutely...
It wouldn't pass. Chat. It wouldn't pass. You shall not pass.
You failed that pull. But if you were to pull the Voidwaker and make it so you can get in the wilderness, but you can also get it outside of the wilderness,
it would pass. It would pass. Continue.
At a much longer time spent at whatever boss it would be, I think that would pass. Now, I know for a fact that if I were to tell myself that opinion a few years ago, I would 100% argue with myself on that. But the thing is, the wilderness does not get meaningful updates. The last actually significant updates that were done were 3 years ago when they reworked the bosses into what they are now and added the Voidwaker. Maybe my old opinion that items that are in the wilderness should only come from the wilderness is valid, but what I would argue to my old self is, do you want to compromise or do you not want to get any updates at all? Because that's where I feel we're at in 2026. We really have not gotten basically any actual content suggestions for wilderness updates other than outside of game jams. Although there was one boss pitch in a summer summit, which I'll get to that. There was a proposed wilderness expansion in 2023, which I did like a lot of aspects of, especially the town that I talked about in my other video. But obviously, nothing came into the game. There definitely was some cool suggestions in it, but I think it was biting off way more than it could chew. There are 2 suggestions in here, though, that are going to be familiar to a lot of you guys. The first suggestion was a tribing rat boss that taught you the basics of PvP. It could also be argued that it would teach you the basics of PvM too, where you have to get your overhead prayers correct. I think this was a good idea, and a lot of people agreed, and eventually it did come into the game in the form of Scurious, just, of course, not in the wilderness. The other suggestion you'll probably be familiar with was a giant wilderness worm boss, which would spawn in random locations and would broadcast to everyone where it was. This boss actually ended up getting pitched twice, once in this game jam and then in a summer summit. Basically, the idea of this boss was it was going to be in the wilderness and it was going to be time gated. It was basically trying to bring Deadman mode breaches into the main game through the wilderness. This idea was so unpopular that it failed with a 49% yes vote. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. I want wilderness updates, but I voted no to this. I think that this was a fundamentally flawed pitch for a wilderness boss. That doesn't mean I don't want wilderness updates, but I really did not like that suggestion. Since then, as far as I can tell, there has only been one other suggestion for the wilderness that would rework it in a big way, and that was the reworking of the current Rev Caves to include a single zone and a multi-zone, and it would go all the way up to about 40 or 50 wilderness or something like that. Now, this was just a game jam. It never went to a poll, but the thing is, if it went to a poll, again, I would have voted no. If they would have wanted to add an additional Rev Caves, which was all multi, I would have voted yes to that. I wouldn't have had a problem with that. And I have no problem with there being extra places in multi with incentives for people to go there. But overall, if people don't like to be PK'd in singles, then they sure as hell are not going to want to be PK'd in multi. And the thing is, even though there was a singles portion of the cave and a multi portion of the cave, in this proposal, it was still proposed to fundamentally rework something that people already like as is. I think the current Rev Cave has a good design. Again, as far as I'm aware, those were basically the only two big updates proposed for the wilderness between 2023 and now. I get why they were unpopular because, again, I didn't even like the ideas, but that doesn't mean I don't think there should be wilderness updates. Of course I want wilderness updates, and I think there is plenty of room for wilderness updates, but again, it comes back to needing that compromise. I think if you're willing to compromise and not force people into the wilderness, that PvP and wilderness updates can absolutely pass. One type of update that I really do like seeing get put into the wilderness is new ways to make money. And I will say, I don't agree with the argument that people are being forced to go in there, unless there is, of course, a unique item from that thing that you can't get outside of the wilderness. In anticipation of making this video, I actually ended up putting out a tweet at—
So what he's saying, like, don't add void wakers to the wilderness, but add high value bosses that drop really good supplies per hour. Let's see. That's just like right off the top what I'm thinking here.
asking people what some of the current pain points of the wilderness are in their opinion and what they would do to improve upon those pain points. I ended up getting a good amount of replies, and if you're someone that did reply to my tweet, I really do appreciate you taking the time to give me your opinion. When it comes to a controversial topic like the wilderness, everyone's gonna have an opinion, and of course everyone is entitled to their opinion, especially when you ask them their opinion. I did end up reading basically every reply I got, and even though I'm not going to be able to recover all of those replies, I did pick out a handful of them that I do think are interesting to discuss. The first reply that I got is that the wilderness resource area should be reworked to not give you ores and fish, but it actually sucks and wait, look, I actually don't even know where the real reply was, to be honest, but it was basically just a resource area work, which I kind of agree it should happen. And I do like the idea of adding a resource area ether pool they can fish from instead of having to kill revs, but you know, whatever. Let's move on. Another reply.
Okay, hear me out, chat. What if you could go AFK for longer in the wilderness and it was slightly faster XP per hour? AFK wildy. And you just pray no one shows up to get you.
I got is to add a wilderness quest line, which I kind of agree with, as long as you don't actually have to go into the wilderness, where you get to go back in time to the third age and actually be in the wilderness and interact with it back before it was the wilderness. Basically, back when it was the Kingdom of Pharenthree. I think that would be really cool to just give more lore to the wilderness, and again, it wouldn't actually interact with PvP in any way. It obviously could interact with PvP, but I don't think that would be popular. I don't think it would come into the game. So that's why I suggested that it doesn't interact with PvP. All I'm saying, you could tie it to a certain town that a certain guy suggested to, which would give you tutorialization of PvP. All right, moving on. Another reply I got was from Matt K, where he said, allow people to reduce their stats when they enter the wilderness so you can easily make different pures and different builds. I definitely do think that this is a cool idea, although I don't know if it would necessarily belong in the wilderness, maybe more so in a mini game itself. Like, that would work really well with Bounty Hunter specifically. But overall, I do actually think that's a good suggestion, because a big barrier to entry of PvP is that a lot of people don't have PvP build accounts. One reply I got is to remove anything Ironman / PVM related and put it elsewhere. And I will say, obviously, I did touch on this a little bit. I don't think you should straight up remove it. I don't think that's the move. But again, like I discussed earlier, if you did find other places to put it outside of the wilderness, then I do think it would solve a lot of issues. I still think the Major Arena 1 and 2 capes should specifically only be in the wilderness because they have been there forever, but everything else I have no issues with. The second part of the suggestion is to then limit the amount of worlds that the wilderness can be accessed in. While I don't really want to take a stance myself on that because I think it's a little more complicated than just limiting it, I do agree that it is a big problem that there are so many different worlds that you can just access the wilderness in. There are a lot of PKers who just want to fight PKers, but the thing is they have to hop through 300 plus worlds in order to actually find a fight. You might not even find a fight for hours. One of the biggest problems that I have and why my videos take such a long time to make when I am making PvP.
Okay, I think that like there's a compromise for this take. Yes, it's a problem that the wilderness is dead. It's because there's too many worlds. But number two, Ironmen would never vote it through because they don't want to be ganked. So you need the compromise of like take the items out of the wilderness that make the Ironmen go in there, or that make the Ironmen feel like they have to go in there, and then reduce the amount of worlds and instead replace it with something different that would incentivize people to go out there if they want to go and risk stuff. For instance, like a boss that drops a lot of prayer potions would be a good reason for an Ironman to go out there and maybe farm it if they want to risk something. And it would be a good farm for mains if they wanted to go out there and farm in the wilderness. And let's see what Frame has to say though.
Videos is actually scouting people out. That's what takes a large majority of time, and it has only gotten worse with the addition of more worlds. And ironically enough, it actually makes it way easier to just look for other PVMers at that point than it is to find other PKers. Another reply I got is to add wilderness only armor charged with GP, and it breaks on death and the GP is dropped to the PKer. Again, I did suggest something like this in my video. And
That's
again, if you made it so it only works
so like Ironmen never lose gear. They only lose like the GP that their gear costs or whatever. So then they're down to risk more gold. They're just not down to risk their time. For instance, I got 200 mil last night, an extra 200 mil. What I could do with that is I could risk more in the wilderness and go when I'm going to do my farms, because I know I have 200 mil in my death coffer or whatever. And I think that would be good. So Ironmen could actually risk a little bit more if they wanted to go to the wilderness, and then PvPers would actually get something if they kill them.
Outside of the wilderness, it doesn't work at anything outside of the wilderness. I do think it would be a welcome change by all. Another reply I got came in 3 points, so I'll address it point by point. The first point being is that the PJ timer got removed and it killed singles clanning overnight. Now, the thing is, I will always stand on the fact that the PJ timer being added to the wilderness was the best possible change for it. Before that, I basically never did any PKing in the wilderness, and after that, I did a ton of PKing in the wilderness. I think it was one of the worst possible things that any clan could get on you if you were in singles at any point in time and you could not have a fair fight. I will personally die on that hill that was one of the best updates for the wilderness, and it made the wilderness a lot more palatable to a lot more players. The second point is that the Granite Maul Handle and the Trover Parchments are basically just attacks that PKers have to pay to bots, which I actually kind of agree. I don't think that the Granite Maul Handle has a place in this game anymore, and I think that the Granite Maul should just be reverted to what it was before. And Trover Parchments probably should just be entirely removed as is. Although there was a whole recent thing that Jagex talked about it in a blog, and I think they are trying to address that. The third point we already basically talked about. There's too many worlds right now. Another reply that I got that I really like is to make PvP worth something to Ironmen. Basically making anti-PKing an incentive for Irons.
Okay, how do you do that though?
Whenever they get a PK, that loot goes into a coffer, and then it can exclusively be traded for bonds at whatever the price is at that point in time. I do think that is a cool suggestion. Basically,
when an Ironman anti-PK someone, it goes into their death coffer, and then their death coffer can be exchanged for bonds. So if an Ironman is anti-PKing, he could earn himself a month of gameplay time without risking any of his items. He's only risking gold. I don't see a ton of negatives because the Ironman isn't getting anything. He's just getting game time for his death coffer. What would be abused from that? He's not getting anything that he can use in the game. It's just death coffer money. The worst thing that you could do with that is if you have a rich main, you could let your Ironman kill your main, and he would get money in his death coffer, and then you're just, which you could just drop bonds to your, you could already drop bonds over. So you're not really doing anything. You can already gift bonds. So there is no abuse. The only real abuse is the death coffer. Like if you have you could just PK your main and now you have like a 500 mil in your death coffer. That's the only thing that would be abusive of it. But we really need to take the risk of items away from the Ironman in the wilderness. Like I do not want to lose an item that takes me, 50 hours to farm, right? Like I would never risk a Bofa because I'm not going back and doing that grind again. But if I have my Bofa out there and then I die, I'm okay risking the 100 mil or whatever. That's fine, but not the time. Then don't go in there. Well, I'm actually in favor of them removing any reason for the Ironmen to be in the wilderness at all. Like everything in the wilderness should be like the dragon pick where it's optional. I'm more on that side of things, but then that kills the wilderness even more. So if they reduce the worlds, you need to replace that risk with something else that like not a collection log item. But then, yeah, it's just tough. Like I'm more so on that side, but that's why I think that there always needs to be compromise. So like everyone has like, there's kind of the extremist take and then there's the meat in the middle. And usually the meat in the middle is always the way to go. So instead of removing everything from the wilderness that an Ironman desires, you meet in the middle and you kind of like see what the compromise is. And then you try to go with that. And so this, what Framed is proposing, is more of the compromise take, where you reduce the amount of worlds to populate the wilderness again. You take away the risk of Ironmen losing their items. Instead, they lose the gold that it costs to, to make those items or whatever. And then you give Ironmans a reason to anti-PK, which is Death Coffer that can be converted into bonds. That's the only reason I could ever see an Ironman, like actually anti-PKing, is like they can buy themselves a little bit more game time or something. It doesn't really break anything. We just went over that. So I think that he's cooking with this. I think this is a good idea.
Basically making it so Irons can PK their membership. There's another reply that had multiple points to it, and I just want to go point by point. First, bring Fist of Guthix back. I have absolutely no problem with that. I thought it was a good minigame. Definitely bring it back. The second point being give us the Untamed Ocean ASAP. I'm guessing for some sort of sailing PvP, but it's not really further expanded upon. I have no opinion on that. The third point being to add a second zombie pirate locker by the Northeast Crash zombie ship in the level 55 wilderness. I'm guessing for better drop rates. Again, I don't have a problem with that either. But this last point I really find interesting. A dramatic overhaul.
Losing gold is still losing time? Then don't risk gold. You still choose how much you risk. That's never going to change. No one's going to make you go to the wilderness with 100 mil on you. Like, why is that a topic? Just choose how much you want to risk always.
Overhaul for the Wilderness Slayer shop featuring items from the OG Bounty Hunter shop so we can buy useful items for PvE. I 100% do think that there is room for an expansion of Wilderness Slayer. Again, I really like the idea of adding Wilderness Clues. That could be one of the rewards from the...
Then you wouldn't use your Bofa in the wilderness? I mean, yes, you would. Because the Bofa is the most expensive item and you don't lose. You don't lose your top 3 or 4 most expensive items if you protect. So... I mean, the only time you would be risking your Bofa is if you're... Are there even items that are more expensive than that you could risk? Like most of the items that are more expensive than that are maybe treads. Most of the items that are more expensive than Bofa are just like the mega rares. So you wouldn't really be risking... You're hardly ever risking more than that. That's why you just take 3 really expensive items and then the rest are dog.
This shop. I absolutely think there's something there. Another suggestion I read isn't for the wilderness, but it's actually for PvP worlds, and it's to add statuettes and bounty hunter crates into PvP worlds. And I would even take that a step further and say allow looting bags to be used everywhere in PvP worlds, because PvP worlds are fun, and I do think expanding on it could be a really sick idea. So I do love the idea of adding statuettes and bounty hunter crates. This last reply I got is 100% correct though. It's that there are a lot of wilderness specific rules that do not apply anywhere else in the game. Kribus actually addressed this in his video on PvP, and overall the video was really well done. But basically in that video, he talks about some of the inconsistencies in PvP. To just name a few inconsistencies, the Tome of Fire, the Tome of Earth, and the Tome of Water all behave differently inside of PvP versus outside of PvP, and even within PvP, they don't even behave the same. There are a lot of inconsistencies. I'm not even going to sit here and say all of them because it would just take way too long, and it's not the point. The point is that there is inconsistencies inside and outside of the wilderness. Now, I will say this, as a PKer, a lot of the changes make sense from a balancing perspective. There's a lot of things that could be abused before in PvP, and thanks to these balancing changes, there is a lot of stuff that was abused in PvP that could no longer be abused. A good example being, you die to some random NPC in a spot in the wilderness, then you go back with gear, you wait for somebody to attack you, and if you're running low on food, you go to your gravestone where you have food stored in there, and you basically just have unlimited supplies. That's obviously absolutely unfair. They did balance it to fix that. That's no longer a problem in PvP, but that's just one of the many things that they did to balance PvP. Again, I really do think it just comes back to tutorialization needing to be a thing in this game. So, yeah. Add that town, please. Add that town. Obviously, I really like that town. I discussed it in the video. But again, ever since I saw it in that game jam, I do think it'd be cool. Regardless, if you do go to that thread, you'll see that a lot of people do not like the fact that they have to kill things in the wilderness if they want items in there. And they don't want to interact with the wilderness whatsoever. So that's why I really do believe that the way forward is compromise. Again, I do think removing wilderness clue steps and then making wilderness specific clues would go a long way with a lot of people, especially if these wilderness clues don't have any third age or anything in them. You don't have to make it a better drop rate or anything. You can just give it its own wilderness loot specific table. Add Dagonhai robes. Hell, you can even add revenant weapons in there at a ridiculously high rate. Maybe that could be the third age of the wilderness clue table. I do think that players would be okay with wilderness updates coming into the game as long as it is a self-contained ecosystem, and if new items come into the game, you give those players a chance to get those items outside of the wilderness, so they do not need to interact with the wilderness at all if they don't want to. Just imagine that the Malediction War just came into the game now. You could either kill the crazy archaeologist that exists inside the wilderness, or you could kill the deranged archaeologist that exists outside of the wilderness, albeit at a slightly worse rate. But the idea of boss variations like the crazy archaeologist and the deranged archaeologist already exists in the game, so maybe you could look at future updates from that angle. With all of that being said, this is a discussion. I do want to hear what you guys have to say down below, and if you agree with me or don't, let me know. And if you guys like discussions on the wilderness and PvP in general, and you want to see me keep doing these on this channel, then consider leaving a like. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will be making a video on the Grandmaster series very soon on this channel, probably in like the next week or two. See you then.
Thank you so much. Awesome. Another awesome video from Framed about PvP. He seems to kind of be like trying to head the way. Torvesta seems to be sad about losing all of his friends to PVM, and Framed is the one trying to like make these constructive videos on how to bring back the PvP and give some ideas to Jagex, which I think that the Jagex should watch this video and, you know, consider it. A lot of the changes I thought were very good. And I'm a big fan of like wilderness weapons, by the way. I think that that's fantastic game design where like you go to the wilderness, you get a weapon that helps you in the wilderness. But the Void Waker is a questionable game design for me because a lot of people dread doing it that don't want to be in the wilderness, but it's literally the best spec weapon in the game besides maybe like a ZCB, or depending on if you're fighting like a demon or if you have like negative flat armor, then you're using like burning claws. But Void Waker is almost like a mandatory grind because of how good it is. If it only worked in the wilderness, it would probably be better. Like if it was a PvP weapon, I would probably prefer that. Even though I'm already done with the Void Waker grind, it's just not something that I really wanted to do. But I think that it's a bit overpowered and it kind of feels like you have to go get it in a way. And so, yeah, the wilderness is a bit of a mess. It's tough when you talk. It's kind of a touchy subject. People really get fired up when you talk about the wilderness. There's like the people that say, you know what, just don't touch it. If you don't like it, don't play. And then there's people that say you shouldn't cater anything for ironmen. And then there's the people that are like kind of like, okay, well, what is the issue? And there's some people that are trying to like think of the compromise. And we need more people that are not so far extreme one way or the other, that are down to meet in the middle and just try to like make the game better in general. So I like having these kind of conversations.